let's jump in and look at the social media research context. And I just want to sort of surface the way that people and researchers around the world have been talking about social media and identity in the last 5-ish years. Probably the most influential paradigm has been this idea of the networked self or network publics. And through that, there's a 2010 collection called The Network Self in which a lot of this is gathered together. And there are 5 particular features that I want to emphasize and highlight, I guess, in terms of the way that identity information is circulating. So the 5 characteristics are, firstly, that identity information is persistent. Once it's online, it tends not to go away. There are obviously exceptions to that, but it takes real effort to delete something. It's not that it takes effort to keep things around, it takes effort to get rid of it. Identity information is replicable. It is trivial to make a copy. Once there is one instance of something on one platform, it takes very little effort for that to be copied onto another platform, another space, another server. Identity information is scalable. It is trivial to make the difference between making 2 copies or making 1 million copies of something online, because its information is negligible. And that gives us real issues, or not issues, real potential for scale, but also then potential issues around that. And probably most importantly, identity information is organized through its searchability. It is the way that Google or Facebook or Twitter or other platforms organize the way that we find identity information. That is the way that most people will receive it. The way that most of us know other people online is through the way that particular platforms and engines allow us to search that information. And the last feature, which I also think is really important, is that information on the platforms that we're talking about is largely owned, and it is corporately owned. This is not public goods, this is not government-run organizations, this is corporate platforms that are managing our identity information. And that is why a number of the issues that I'll talk about later arise. Another theorist, Anne Hellman, adds a couple of features that are important. One is the idea that identity is in perpetual beta, which is a sort of a punning way of simply saying identity is never complete online. The system always wants more. Facebook and Twitter and Google want to know what you're doing next. What are you doing now? What is today's thing that you're going to add to your identity? Is never a complete picture. And significantly, when Anne talks about user-generated identity, she's talking about other users. She's talking about the fact that we don't just portray ourselves online. Other people share photos, they share videos, they share anecdotes, they share information, and that becomes part of the picture of who we are. Often the thing that will come up as the first or second or third result when somebody Googles your name will not be a thing that you've created, but a thing that somebody else has created about you in your name in some capacity. And that is significant when we think about the way that this information moves about. The last frame I want to mention is work that I've done along with a colleague, Matthew Allen, which is looking at particularly about how much control we retain over the information about us once it's out there. So we talk about the difference between internet footprints, which are those bits of information that we create, so maybe a Facebook post that we then can go back and delete and do something with later. We may not think about the amount of effort we're putting into creating it, but we retain control largely. We juxtapose that with digital shadows, which is information about us which, for whatever reason, falls out of our control. It might be a platform that we no longer have access to. It might be something that somebody else has posted that is referring to our name, or 100 other reasons. We like then to use the metaphor of social media rivers, the idea that when we look at someone's identity, we're looking at the assemblage of that identity across different platforms, and like anything that's made of water, when we look at it once, the next person to look at will see something similar but different. So the picture that we get is always changing and evolving. And we contrast this, I guess, with what was, the big catchphrase 10 years ago was this idea of user-generated content, that platforms were giving us the space to express ourselves. Now we've shifted to the idea of content-generated users. It's how all these bits get stuck back together to tell the story of individuals. In all of those models, individual agency is central. The ability of the person who is being talked about on those platforms, who is hopefully doing the talking about themselves. Their ability to control, their ability to do things with that is a central concern. There is a presumption that the person who is being described should maintain control, that the curatorial self, the self that is self-describing, should always be able to add and change and mould that description as they see fit. And when issues come up around platforms, often the answer to problems is to give more agency. So it might be better privacy settings. If we want to have finer grained control over what Facebook does and doesn't show other people, we might want better terms about what Facebook can do with our search history, whether it can share it with agencies or whether it can share it with the government or whether it can share it with anyone or not. But often we answer, we need to fix things by having more agency. This is not a graph, it's just a rough approximation of a lifespan, that what it might look like if we were to visualize it. So in our darker blue, we might see our footprints, the bits that we maintain control over, and lighter blue would be the stuff that we don't have control over. And there will always be stuff about us that we don't have control over that may or may not be important at any point, but it will always be there. The way that platforms are designed, there will always be stuff that's essentially out of our control. Most research, and the research that I've described, happens here. It is where people are of age, it is where people are able to make conscious and rational choices about their information, and it is about the active subject who has agency to make change. The impetus for the project I'm talking about is to look at the ends, to look at birth and to look at death, the bits where people will not have agency. Obviously, once you've passed away, your agency is over. The stuff about you is out there, and we have to, as a culture, decide what happens to that stuff. But right at the beginning, there is a whole lot of sharing that happens either at the moment of birth or before the moment of birth, where a person is named into being by their parents, by their loved ones. And this is almost always a really joyful experience, but we are doing that somewhat in the blind. We don't have a context for that initial description, and we haven't thought through what consequences there might or might not be when we start that sharing. And that's part of what hopefully I'm going to talk about today. A significant shift that surrounds all of this discussion is the shift to the real name web. So for a long time, the internet was a space where you could, inverted commas, be anyone. So you could use pseudonyms, you could describe yourself however you wanted. You had a lot of freedom in the way that you named and the way that you described yourself. You might use pseudonyms, you might completely fabricate an identity, but there has been a huge push in the last 3 to 5 years to a real name web. Facebook and Google in particular have been driving this idea that it is inauthentic to have multiple identities. It's inauthentic to have false names or present yourself in a way that isn't coherent and singular. And that's a big shift in the way that identity works online. And that context matters because it's, amongst other things, means that the legacy of the information that we share under a real name is much more likely to be stuck back together and point to the individual that it refers to. We can see some of the problems with that by looking at this little cartoon featuring Superman, where if we think about his real name, it doesn't really fit into the boxes that Facebook or Google would provide. I just presume no one found that funny. Okay. All right. Was it too small? All right, great, sorry. My bad then, it's too small. I'm relieved to know that it wasn't such a deadpan joke. It was that wonderful moment where you're like, light relief? No. Okay. So, following the work of Erving Goffman, who is a sociologist who's been sort of resurrected by internet studies and been going, oh, this guy knew about the internet before it was an internet, he talks about the performed self. So he talks about front stage, which is what we put off, and the backstage, which is what he calls your more authentic self, but he doesn't see performance as a bad thing. He sees performance as something that we always do. It's being contextually aware. We always put on a different face for a different crowd. That's not inauthentic, it's just difference. But if we use Goffman, then we have to ask who prepares the stage, who takes leaves the reins of identity to be inherited, who does the work to set up identity when someone's very young, when we know that they exist, when they know that they're around, how will young people inherit that information? What is the dialogue between parents who share photos about their kids and that kid when they start to self-fashion? The idea of teenage rebellion becomes quite complicated when all of your potty training pictures are on Facebook, for example. And at the other end, we have the question of who looks after all of this stuff once people die. And while that might sound a little bit trivial, there is a lot, increasingly large amounts of stuff locked up in not just on Facebook, but say, for example, in email accounts that is vital for people. So that these are questions that the law doesn't have easy answers for yet, so questions that we need to ask. So, as I say, at one end we have parents as the initial curators of identity. We curate our kids into being. Deborah Lupton has a wonderful book where she talks about the sharing of the ultrasound photo on social media now as a rite of passage. It's part of the process of sharing with the world that you're going to be a parent. And it is, for the most part, a very joyful thing. This isn't something to be berated, but it is something that creates a history of someone in a way that will last a very, very long time. If we go back to Superman, and I apologise if it's not readable, if Superman's parents shared all of his baby pictures, if the Kents shared what Superman did as a baby, it would have been very difficult for him to then have the freedom to fashion his own identity as Superman down the track. So there are some questions about the way that the stuff that gets shared in early life impacts on identity later on. Right, thank you for laughing, even if that was just to make me not feel so embarrassed. Okay, so let's jump into the first case study. And to do that, are most people familiar with Instagram? Is that a thing that's... No? Okay, so Instagram is probably the world's most popular dedicated photo sharing app now for phones. Instagram is... trying to think of an analogy that doesn't refer to another social media platform. I can't think of one. So basically, it's a way of taking photos and sharing it with friends. And Instagram matters, I guess, because for all sorts of reasons, but partially because it's one of the world's largest, fastest growing platforms at the moment, but also because it's where the youth demographic is. So if you're an advertiser at the moment, you're much more interested in advertising on Instagram, more so than almost anywhere else, except perhaps Snapchat, but we won't do that today. So every instance of an Instagram photograph or an Instagram video has a bunch of metadata around it, so a bunch of bits of information that circulate around that photograph. And it's looking at that collage of information, if you like, that was the fundament of the project that Tim Highfield and I did to design an Instagram mapping tool. Yes?
Is it just a photo, or does someone say where it is or what it means, or is there commentary?
Yes, absolutely. So there is... No, it's not just a photo. So you will have an image or a video field, which is the sort of central point of it, but it will also have all of these additional features. So it will have the username, it will have the picture of that user, it will have an exact timestamp of when that image was taken, it will have a description field, which I think is it infinite? But it's an incredibly long description field. Most people use 2 or 3 lines, but you can just keep typing and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. In that field, many people will use tags. So if you use the hash, pound, or number symbol, depending on how you want to describe it, but the double lines before a word, that is a way of indicating that this is a tag of some importance. Tags used to be simply indexical. We wanted to organize information, we would tag something. Now tags can be ironic, they can be humorous, but tags are important because it's the way that individual users indicate that they think information might be organized. One of the reasons that this is complicated is that there is also a commentary function. So every Instagram image or photograph has a comment section that continues indefinitely. So from a researcher's point of view, we have to sort of judge at what point should we trawl for these images, and then at what point should we go back. If we want to capture things like likes and comments, how long do we allow people to comment on things? So we found, on average, Instagram photos get comments that they drop off radically at the end of about 2 days, and by the end of a week, 99% of images have got all the comments they'll ever get. So that's our ballpark for how long we're allowed to go back. What we did then with this tool that we developed was to go and track the ultrasound hashtags. So these are images that were consciously tagged with ultrasound. They weren't just featuring ultrasound imagery, but somebody had consciously written ultrasound with a tag at the front to identify it in that manner. And obviously this is only publicly shared information. There is the ability to have a private Instagram account. We have no stats on how many there are, but we know we can't see that information. So what Tim and I did in 2014 and have just repeated in 2015 was simply track that tag for 3 months to see how much stuff we got and then take a deeper look at it. So you can see across March, April and May of 2014, we got a total of just over 11,000 media items that were publicly shared using the ultrasound hashtag. To make that into a task then where we could actually go in and individually look at images and decide what is this about, to tag it, to describe it, to look at it more deeply, we chose the first Monday of each month. We pulled just the images from those Mondays, and that's what we looked at in detail. And what I'm talking about today is just the March 2014 data, because that's a manageable set of images. So that,
Is this
yep.
Australia or?
No, this is globally, yeah. And we know from the information that we're pulling today that if for the 2015 data, it's grown exponentially, which is why we're focusing on the 2014 stuff for now, because it's manageable. Okay, so of that 289 images, what do we see? We see a bunch of stuff. We see advertising, and we see 6 things that are completely irrelevant, which we just scrubbed completely. We see the very strange subgenre of ultrasound humour. So that is photoshopping in things like a Starbucks cup or a wad of cash or oversized genitalia are the 3 most popular. And looking at how people talk about ultrasound humour is a whole separate project now. Tim and I are doing a thing on visual humour on the internet because it's just fascinating that it exists. Obviously, ultrasound doesn't just mean it's actually it's not even the right word. Technically, it should be sonogram. But ultrasound doesn't just refer to pregnancy imagery. So there were 17, including 1 dog, that were medical ultrasounds that were not relating to pregnancy. Significantly, and I'll come back to this, between the time that we got the metadata, which is all the text, and the time that we went to look for the images, which was about a fortnight later, 15 images had been deleted or made private. So this shows a conscious change, and I'll come back to that in a little while. We saw 32 photos which depicted the social experience around an ultrasound. So it's often a selfie in the mirror. I'm about to go and have my first ultrasound. Oh my gosh, I'm so nervous. Or here's me and my partner in the car on the way to the first ultrasound. And it's usually the first ultrasound that's being described in these images. We saw 32 what we might call professional or collage type images. So images where effort has been made to present this other than just a photograph. So we might see photos that 5 years ago would have actually been a photograph of an ultrasound held up over a stomach. We now see that the iPhone or the phone held in front of the stomach is the most popular, 21st century version of that. We also see a number of people who are doing these sort of storytelling collages where they are telling a story that has multiple frames, that is doing that work of sort of digital storytelling even within a single frame on Instagram. And obviously I've blanked out the tops of these. We saw 71 photos, or 26% of what was shared, included the full metadata that you see on the screen when you go and have an ultrasound done. Now, this needs to be framed in particular ways, but it can include the mother's full name, the mother's date of birth, the medical facility where it's taking place, the estimated gestation period, so the due date, the date of the scan, and so on and so forth. This obviously matters. It should be on the screen, but it probably shouldn't be shared publicly. And there's a number of sort of layers in which we have to think about that. One is, if you're having an ultrasound and you're excited, you're probably not thinking about that. Secondly is the presumption that if it's in an image, it's not searchable. And 5 years ago, that was largely true. Today, it's largely untrue. It is almost effortless to extract text back out of an image, which is something that all of the larger platforms do. Probably more importantly, we saw 38% where there was either deliberate or anecdotal screening of that information. So either they'd zoomed in a particular way, or we saw some where there was very purposeful blurring at the top, or we see this lovely twins photo where they had scrubbed the information and then added their own sort of little annotation of the 2 babies. So we see that for the most part, people are thinking about whether they want to share that information or not. Obviously, at that point, video was just getting started on Instagram. There are a couple, 2 had personally identifiable information, 3 didn't, and 2 others were not relevant. It's also worth noting that there is a direct messaging tool within Instagram that was added in December 2013. We have no way of knowing how much is shared by that tool, but it is a reasonable presumption that a large number of these sort of images are shared privately. You can share with up to 15 people at a time. It's probably reasonable to expect that a lot of ultrasounds are shared, if using this platform, using a private tool. But as I say, as researchers, we have no way of giving you any sort of information about that. And it should be noted that Instagram is not representative of culture as a whole. It is representative of a very specific demographic of people, of largely English speaking, largely more affluent than not, obviously mobile phone users. So it constrains the sort of pool that we're talking about. So the biggest thing that was raised from looking at that obviously was the question of privacy. I flagged before that 15 images have been deleted or hidden. So it might be that somebody has made the Instagram account private, or it might be that they've deleted the image. Either way, it shows that within a fortnight of posting something, a number of people have had a conscious moment where they've gone, actually, I'm not sure I want to share this publicly, which is a really good sign. The 71 images that do share information that is personally identifiable, I'm willing to argue very few of those people who have done so have thought it through, have thought about why they're doing that. That is not to say it's necessarily a bad thing, but it is to say it probably hasn't been thought through in a manner that is making it an informed choice, if you like. And that's one of the challenges in this area, and one of the reasons why it's important is that we do need to try and integrate literacies in this area in a way that we perhaps haven't yet. The other thing that matters is to remember that platforms themselves change. So Instagram as a tool was launched in 2010. It was only available on Apple iPhones. It was only available via the App Store. And at that time, that was a relatively small number of people. Over the space of the 4 years that we map here, Instagram has become multiple platform, and it has gone onto the web. So there is a way of seeing Instagram photos now on the web, for example. There was no ability to do that when it was launched, but perhaps most importantly was that in 2012, Facebook purchased Instagram. So a lot of people still say, oh, I don't like Facebook, but I use Instagram. Well, both of them feed into the same database in the background. So whatever you're doing on Instagram informs the ads that you might be served on Facebook, for example. So the idea of different platforms is really difficult and complicated, but it is worth noting that platforms themselves, when we talk about them, are sort of moving targets. We want to talk about what it means to use Instagram. We have to keep in mind that Instagram itself changes from day to day. And to our great horror, in 2014 at the end, for example, the ability to edit the comments after the fact that you'd posted them became possible, which from a social point of view is great, means you can fix typos and whatever, but from a research point of view means you never know when they're going to finish changing something, so you never know when to capture that data. Also in this area we see Sprout. Sprout is a very popular brand of pregnancy and baby tracking. It is, for the most part, really, really useful. It gives you all sorts of statistics and norms. A colleague of mine has been using it amazingly dedicatedly, as you can see from these charts, has tracked, for example, what am I looking at? I'm looking at feeding patterns and sleep patterns. And as you can see, they are very normalized. You can then measure these against statistical norms. So is my baby sleeping as much as a normal 10-week-old? Is it eating roughly the same amount? So on and so forth. All of which, I should add, is information that people tracked long before we had apps. So this is stuff that people might have done in paper notebooks if they were worried about weight or whatever. What does matter is that all of this stuff that we're recording is then sent back onto a server that is managed by a corporation. And almost nobody has read the terms of use that govern that app when you click. And to be fair, we've seen lots of studies that show that if you did read all the terms of use of the apps on your phone on average, you'd spend about 14 weeks a year reading terms of use. So nobody will. But they are important because they govern what that information, what can be done with it. They govern who can use that information. They govern whether Sprout, for example, can develop a new statistical norm because they have so much information flowing in a way that might go above and beyond even sort of medical norms. So there's real questions around data sharing there. And this, of course, is the most extreme example I could find, but this is the owlet anklet, which is a biomedical monitor that you put around the ankle of a baby. And then, in the most bizarre advertising ever, you can be in a park. One presumes having left the baby with a nanny, looking at the stats of your child who hasn't died but might be lonely. I don't know. So clearly that ad was didn't run very long, and they chose to do a better one. And the anklet itself now is called a health sock. So it's but you know, what is normalizing here is the idea that we will transform and encode the biometrics of a baby into data that is shared with a third-party service. There are really good reasons to do this. If you've got a baby who is in danger of all sorts of things, knowing their heart rate and oxygen levels is really important. I'm not in any way suggesting it's not. I'm suggesting having a corporation then look after that information is possibly the bit of the story that's problematic. This we've sort of theorised as intimate surveillance. We're trying to deliberately use that contradiction. Intimate because this is almost always well-meaning. Nobody's recording this stuff because they're evil. They're recording this stuff because they care about either sharing joy or sharing medical information that they think is important to the well-being of their child. But they're often doing so because platforms have very carefully designed things, because sharing as caring means you keep coming back to the platform. You keep seeing the ads, you keep interacting, you keep making money for them. So there's a real contradiction at the heart of this. Okay, I need to jump on to death now. So I've talked about birth in a slightly scary one. It's not meant to be that scary. Death, because that's more fun. Okay. How do Facebook and Google think about death? And I'll do this very quickly. When we die, we leave a whole lot of stuff behind. We leave email, we leave photos, we leave videos. We have, if you like, digital estates. The law in Australia, the law in all but 2 or 3 states in the US, and most other places does not currently address that information specifically. And when people have tried to use the law to engage with digital estates, it rarely works very well. Corporate policies almost never address this information until it becomes a big enough problem. And what I want to do then is juxtapose the 2012 situation with what's happened today for Facebook and Google. Google used to have a policy, and this is just part of it. If you wanted to get into someone's email account after they died and you were their loved one, you had to have your full name, your physical mailing address, your email address, a photocopy of a government ID, the Gmail address of the user, the death certificate. You had to have the header information, so you had to go into their email and get the hidden information around the top of it that tells you it really did get sent to you from that account. You had to then send that by mail. This is Google, people. By mail. And then they would review it, and they might give you access. And if they don't give you access because of privacy, because of the enshrined individual right of privacy that the individual had before they died, they can't tell you why they decide not to if they don't. So that was 2012, and obviously that situation was untenable. Also because Google centralized all of their policies, so they had a single privacy policy and a single delete button, which meant that if you deleted one account, it often deleted all of the others, which if you did get into someone's email account was great. You could manage their email. Then when you finished delete the account, you discovered you've just deleted all of their YouTube videos. So that system was very much the Google single sign-on approach. One password, everything in one place, but if you break it, it breaks everywhere. Thankfully, Google now has what they've wonderfully, is the most software engineer way of describing something, a Google Inactive Account Manager. How many people know they have that, by the way? Anyone? One person, 1.5. Cool, great. Okay, so a Google Inactive Account Manager lets you select certain things that will happen if you have not logged into your account for a period of time. So they do not use death in the description of this. They simply say, if you haven't logged in for X period of time, you can set certain things in place to happen. It will give you a warning a month before it happens, but the minimum timeout you can set is 3 months. For anyone that's ever managed the estate of someone that's passed away, you will know waiting 3 months to get into their email account simply won't cut it. It's an engineer's solution to a social problem, and it's an engineer's solution that does not work. If you have to wait 3 months to start managing the account of someone that's passed away, you're doing it wrong. And that's where, even though we've got certain answers now like this in Active Account Manager, they're not very good answers. Facebook in 2012 had an all or nothing approach. They had been one of the first platforms that had a policy about how to deal with death, because people had started to get friend suggestions, and they'd said, I don't want that friend suggestion, I know that friend has passed away. Because the algorithms would go, oh, here's someone who you're connected to, suggest friend, and that became there was lots of press around it, it was all a bit irksome. And so Facebook went, right, we'll give you a choice. You can either get rid of it, or you can memorialize it. Memorialization means freezing the account at that moment in time. Whatever the last stuff you posted on your account lasts forever. You hope that the last thing you didn't post was, God, my sister's a bitch, or something like that, because it would be there for eternity. But it was a very blunt tool. Now, Facebook has a slightly better term. They have a Facebook legacy contact, and how many people have Facebook accounts? Most. How many people have heard of this? Ooh, 6 or 7. That's awesome. Okay, Facebook's PR team did much better. Your legacy contact can manage certain elements about your page. They can change your profile picture. They can accept new friend requests after you've passed away, presumably so people can mourn on your page. That's not as silly as it sounds. There is reason to have those connections. And they can... There's one other thing they can do. I think they can choose a sort of a central picture that remains. They cannot delete stuff. And this is, again, one of those things where Facebook is trying to balance a privacy policy, the individual rights of the person that had that account, with the needs of the person that would be managing it as a memorial space. But the idea that a Facebook account can't have stuff deleted after somebody passes away is probably incommensurate with the way that Facebook is designed. It is a curation tool, and one presumes most people would want to at least clean it up a bit if it's going to last forever. And yes, this is my cynical take on why that particular tool will stick around. You can't sell ads to dead people, but you can sell ads at the funeral. And that is the truth of it. If you go to a page on the anniversary of when someone dies, you'll see the ads surrounding it. And that's Facebook's rationale for why it's worth investing in this sort of thing. There are third-party tools like Perpetu, which are largely a violation of the terms of use of the platforms we're talking about, but do a better job. So they will set up things like, okay, log all your passwords in here, log someone you want to know all those passwords, give us, I think they have dual authentication, so you have to have at least 2 people that will vouch that you're actually dead, who you trust. And if they both do, then this goes into process. And there are a number of other third-party tools now like that, which are trying to tackle the question of digital estates. Okay, I realise I've talked far too long, but some tentative conclusions then. Intimate surveillance, going back to birth, normalises a surveillance culture. And that is problematic. It's not evil, but it does mean that we are so used to sharing things about other people that we don't think about it anymore. We need better literacies about the uses and potential abuses. And I'm saying these things not as we expect these companies to be evil. It's not in their interest to be evil, but it's in their interest to make money. And we need to remind ourselves of that. These are platforms that are corporations. The corporations are there to make money. That's who they answer to, not to us. More transparency, I would argue, is required about how data can be shared. What have we actually agreed to? We need terms of use that we can actually skim and look at as human beings, not as a team of lawyers. And social norms need to evolve. The weird experience of being at a 6-year-old's birthday party and going, it's great, there's lots of pictures being taken, but I know that the parent taking them is, I wouldn't say an overshare, but doesn't delete things. I don't want pictures of my kids in that set. How do I have that conversation? We don't have social norms for that, and they can be really awkward and difficult moments. You're ruining the kids' party bringing this up. Don't be a downer, let's just enjoy it. So the evolution of social norms needs to happen, and we do need to have some awkward conversations. At the other end, official posthumous policies simply need to be better. They're too blunt, and they remain too blunt despite some steps in the right direction. Where we see single sign-on services, where we see all tools being collected under a single password, where we see all of Google's many tools in one place, or Facebook suddenly having single sign-ons to other places, we need to think about what that means and have the ability to unpick things if we need to at the other end. We do need to be mindful of the ad hoc responses, so tools like Perpetu, but we also need to keep in mind that they do violate the terms of use. Facebook specifically says you can't give your password to anyone else. If you do, they do have the right to close your account. And at some point, there'll be a turf war between the third-party legacy managers and the more official tools, and that will be, well, it'll be in the age tech section at the top. Digital executors need to have fine-grained control over digital legacies, and that needs to be enshrined in law, and we need to get those laws right. And no country in the world has got those laws right yet. And lastly, as soon as a social media company is even starting, it should commit what's going to happen to that data. Will it be maintained? Will that company say, I'll keep this stuff online? The flip side of this, of course, is something like MySpace, which is a platform that is completely disappeared now. But for a lot of people, you know, that MySpace account might have been the last thing that their child that died in a car accident ever posted. It's gone now, and there was no warning, there was nothing you could do about it. So this isn't just what's going to last forever, it's will things arbitrarily disappear? We need transparency on that. And last but not least, we're now starting to conceptualize this as the problem of the social media contradiction. The platforms want us to always think about the social, about the sharing, about the communication, but they profit from the media side, from the fact that it lasts and sticks around. We all need to be mindful of that, and we need policies and literacies that will allow everybody to be aware of that when they're using these tools. Okay, apologies that was slightly longer and a bit ranty.